So
yeah, go ahead, Jana. I think we're on.
Yeah, I just wanted to give more people the chance to join us. And they are still incoming, but I officially start now. Thank you, Jeremy. So welcome to our webinar, Dormant NATO, Future Prospects and Challenges. We are delighted that you take the time to join us and prefer us over whatever else you have to do. We think that this topic is of particular importance, not only in light of the upcoming NATO summit, but also looking at the American election in November. And we think that whoever wins this election poses challenges for the Europeans. So the aim of this webinar is to talk about the concept of a dormant NATO with actually the mastermind behind it, the person who has coined the phrase, at least, and to discuss the concept, to discuss the implications of a possible Trump administration. We look into a Biden 2 scenario, and we look at it from a European/NATO perspective. And to do all this, I'm not alone. Thanks goodness, I have three wonderful fellows and colleagues with me. And first, I want to welcome our guest, Sumantra Maitra, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Renewing America. He has written the, by now, I think, quite famous policy brief, Pivoting the US Away from Europe to a Dormant NATO, that was published in February 2023 and made quite some headlines. So read it if you haven't. Dr. Maitra has meanwhile also written a book on Russia, which he might mention in his introductory remarks, because I think the way he sees Russia also influences the way he thinks about a dormant NATO. But I'm also delighted that I have two wonderful colleagues of mine joining, Jeremy Shapiro, who is ECFR Research Director, but who's also the head of our US program. And Camille, who is Distinguished Policy Fellow with ECFR and has previously served as Assistant Secretary General of NATO for Defense Investment. We will run the show as follows. Sumantra Maitra will kick us off by laying out the concept of a dormant NATO, the idea behind it, why he thinks it's necessary that the US pivots away from Europe, and also that would be my wish to tell us a bit how he thinks a second Trump administration will react to his proposals. So how much has, to his knowledge, the campaign team picked up these ideas. And then Jeremy will talk about a Biden 2 scenario, the challenges that this would be posing for Europe, and also reflect a bit on the thinking within the Democratic Party on NATO and NATO's future. And then my colleague Camille will talk about what the Europeans need to do in NATO, or more broadly, to adapt to the challenges. And we start with you, Dr. Maitra, without further ado.
Thank you very much. I've already mentioned to Jana, and I apologize to the people who are listening. I broke my voice because I was shouting for England last night. And that's how I lost my voice. I'm going to try and, be as coherent and clear as possible. And the second thing is, thank you, Jana, for inviting me and Jeremy. Glad you guys read the brief. I have to mention, I'm compelled to mention at this quarters that I don't speak for the president's campaign or his policy people. I wrote the brief, it got famous, it got outed in Rolling Stone, and that is pretty much it. I don't speak for the president, I don't speak for his campaign team. I don't even know if this would be institutionalized in the next administration. And even if it does, in what form? With that being said, the fundamentals of this strategic posture, or a doctrine, as ECFR coined it, are three. One, the structural realities in front of the United States is different than how it was 20 years back. Part of the reason is of the policies that US chose to do in the last 20 years, including the war on terror, wasting 20 years in the Middle East, trying and reshape a continent, a region which is basically inhospitable to the ideas that America wanted to export. Trade issues, the financial issues, trade with China, all of these resulted in a way where the relative power of the US declined. Now, that doesn't mean that the US is not the most powerful country in the world. It still is. But preponderance in a global balance doesn't mean hegemony. I want to be very specific about the difference between those two. Hegemonic power and a preponderant power are very different, by the way. Britain, for example, was preponderant immediately after Napoleon. It wasn't a hegemon, it was an offshore balancer. There were other powers which were relatively quite powerful as well. So that's point number one. The structural reality in front of the US is different than the structural reality that US had in 2002 or 2003. Point number two, because of the structural reality that the US faces and the relative gravity that has moved to Asia, the choices of regardless which administration is in power would be very same. There is one thing which unites the Republicans and the Democrats, even though there is no unity as to how to deal with it. But fundamentally, the topic that unites the Republicans and the Democrats now is the rise of China. That is not going to change, and understandably so. China is a power which has got production capacity and manpower, which is more than the combined production capacity and manpower of the European Union, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and UK. This is not something that people are making up. It's a fact. It is also a great power, which is heavily building up its navy, storing grains in silos, and preparing a merchant marine fleet. Great powers don't do that kind of stuff for nothing, right? I mean, maybe they are very benevolent and they just like to give people jobs and, building 20 ships in one shipyard, but it is unlikely. So there is something that is happening in Asia, and the US, given that Asia is the financial hub of the world, it is the biggest trade region in the world, the gaze of the United States would inevitably shift to the east. Point number three, Russia is a nuisance in Europe. That is a fact. There is no questioning that. Doesn't mean that Russia is a hegemonic threat. Again, there is a difference, and this is the kind of thing that would help people make policy. But policy starts with analyzing as to the ground realities. Russia is a powerful state. It is also a very broken state. The total manpower of Russia is 143 million. The total GDP is 1.8 trillion compared to European Union's 18 trillion combined, by the way. But it also has 6,000 nukes, and that is an unfortunate reality. Now, what happens for those who have studied history? What similar situations Europe faced where you had to satiate a power which is not a hegemonic threat, but also a relatively influential power in the fringes of the continent? Post 1815, post Napoleon Europe, during the Concert of Europe, Russia was a satiated power at that point of time. It is not the same Russia because they feel like they are they're on the receiving end of our treatment. I don't buy that, but I'm not the one deciding policy for Russia, right? It doesn't matter what we think we are doing. At the end of the day, if you have to understand your rival, you have to understand what they are thinking we are doing to them. So that's one of the things so these are the three structural realities. Now, NATO, because of the structural realities of NATO, there needs to be some of the things that we have to keep in mind. One, NATO is capable of defending those who are inside the club. That, again, is one of the fundamental topics that I've constantly mentioned, is if you are inside the club, you need to close the door and you need to be happy about it because there are people who are going to defend you. But if you're inside the club and you're opening the door and punching someone and then coming back in, that is not something that a lot of people would be interested in doing or defending. So that is one thing which I've written in that paper, that one, NATO at the end of the day acts really good as a defensive alliance. It is a needed alliance. For those who have read my brief, obviously Jana knows, but others too, that I don't suggest that the US would or should retrench from Europe or leave NATO. First of all, that is not going to happen. It's a treaty. You cannot just get out of the treaty without the Congress coming into play. Second, I'm a realist. Realism dictates that is not going to fly. It is just not going to happen, regardless of what anyone thinks about, coming out of NATO. It is not going to happen. So it's stupid to even think about a scenario where US is just not there anymore. Number three, Dormant NATO doesn't need the Congress. Moving troops is executive of the president, prerogative of the president. It's within the executive power of the president. And it has happened before. One of the last times we had this massive number of troops moving from Europe was in 1993. The total number of troops at that point of time was 330,000. By 95, it was 66. So there is already a template of moving or relocating troops from inside Europe to either mainland US or to the Middle East and other parts of the world, depending on the strategic threat perceptions of the US. So that template is already there, and it doesn't need the Congress, and it could be done by the US president alone. That being said, I do think, and I've written that in my brief, that it is in the US interest to provide a nuclear umbrella. We need a Europe which is stable. We need Europe which is at peace. And we need Europe which is fundamentally aligned to the United States. Where I differ from some of the European strategists are, if you talk to people in the European Union or the strategic minds or the think tanks, they focus on European defense from the EU perspective. I don't think that is feasible. One of the reasons that is not feasible is because the EU has got no coherent interest. It is an entity which is constantly mutating and expanding. And if you have an entity with no fixed geographical boundaries, you cannot have fixed geographical interests. And interest at the end of the day is geostrategic. So what I do think could happen is to have the traditional powerful states of Europe, including Germany, including France, Britain, they should take more of the burden that is in the European continent. That doesn't mean that Germany has to go back to 1940s. It could mean that Germany needs to go back to 1989. There is a template. Nothing that I'm suggesting is new. It has already happened before. In 1989, for example, Germany had 12 divisions. One of the reasons that they don't have 12 divisions is because they don't see the threat that they faced when Russia was right next in East Berlin. Part of the reason that Germany doesn't feel that much threat, or there is, at the end of the day, revealed preferences are preferences, right? So you cannot convince people in Luxembourg that Russian tanks would be flowing through Poland and Germany and crossing the border to Belgium when they cannot go and conquer Kiev. So again, the paradox of Russia being a powerful state in the periphery of Europe, but not powerful enough to change the European strategic threat perception, is a paradox that Europe needs to face on its own. So what could be done are the traditional powerful states of Europe, including France. Obviously, France talks about strategic autonomy, and that is a good thing. I do think Europe needs to be strategically autonomous. And Germany, which is the economic power of Europe. What they can do is very simple. They take the logistics, they take the armor, infantry, the small things that Europe can do on its own tomorrow if they want to, and they take the coordination and command of those things and leave the naval and the nuclear umbrella to the US. So when Jana wrote that brief and she said that I suggest burden shifting instead of burden sharing, that is not true. What I suggest is burden shifting towards the goal of burden sharing. So the burden shifting is tactical. The strategic aim is still burden sharing. We are sharing the burden with the European Union with the aim that we are tactically shifting the burden in some of the domains where Europe is good and keeping the other things to the US. My final point before I end is, again, this is not something that is dedicated to a specific individual or a specific entity, but fundamentally, you have to understand something. If moderation in burden sharing doesn't work, you would empower voices which are far more radical. This is a time where, purely for the sake of European and American interest and coordination and, and preservation of peace, there needs to be a different structural reality. There needs to be a different security architecture in place. That has happened before in 1990s. Security architecture has changed in 93. It might change again. It changed in post-2001, by the way, when people forget that we were aligned with Vladimir Putin when he was crushing the Chechens because we wanted to have bases in Central Asia. Structural realities determine strategic threat perceptions, and they determine the structure, the security architecture that's in place. That needs to happen anyway, because if that doesn't happen, the current posture is unsustainable. And what I suggest in my brief is a moderate position where there could be a new architecture where there is more burden sharing between the two big powers, the European Union and the US in the West. That doesn't mean that Europe needs to do everything that America wants. That doesn't mean that America will do everything that Europe desires. But it would be a shared interest and a shared understanding based on the shared interest. If that doesn't happen, if this continues where America takes the majority of the burden and Europe doesn't take that much of the burden, then I fear that there might be a situation that my friend Bridge Colby mentioned once, like tomorrow there's a war in Asia. And at that point of time, you don't get the chance to develop the strategic structure that you need in Europe. And the retrenchment of troops is more precipitous. To avoid that scenario, I think there needs to be a settlement between the two in the next few years, or the next decade. I think I should probably stop there. My time is running up, but I'll leave it to the others and ready to answer questions.
Super, thank you very much. I already have two, but I wait till my colleagues are done with their presentations. And I want to encourage the audience to ask questions. You can do that in the Q&A section. And if I don't get the question, I also might give you the floor, then you can ask it directly. But first, Jeremy, how does it look like from a democratic perspective? And what do you think should Europe expect if Trump gets reelected?
I think you meant if Biden gets reelected.
What did I say? Did I say Trump? Oh God, yeah. No. Biden gets reelected, of course. That's what I meant.
Right. Yeah. So, on a certain level, the Biden administration, a second Biden administration's idea of NATO and of European security is not that difficult to tease out because, of course, we have the first term, and it's not going to be dramatically different or really different at all. But I think it is worth maybe pointing out the contrast that you see in the Biden approach from the Trump approach, and to see what would likely be the Trump approach, and to see where it contrasts with some of the things that Sumantra was getting at. And it's interesting. It's a little bit less in the details than it is in the sort of Gesamt concept, if I can try a German word, in the sort of overriding idea of what alliances and what NATO are in US policy. Trump is very often associated, and I think accurately, with the idea that alliances and allies are not nearly as important, or they're not as good a deal for the United States as is commonly said. And I think that the Biden administration represents, in the tradition of Democratic, but also even Republican administrations before Trump's, a view that allies and alliances are absolutely central. They are the core American strength. And Biden has said this many times in his major foreign policy speeches, that it is our alliance system that sets us apart from countries like Russia and China, that we have dozens of friends and treaty allies around the world, and the Chinese have, North Korea. And within that system of alliances that sustains American security and American power, the role of NATO in that is really quite central, because NATO is kind of the jewel in the crown. It is the strongest, the clearest, the biggest alliance, the one that saw victory in the Cold War, and the best way that the United States has of sort of expressing leadership in the world, but especially expressing leadership in NATO. Part of that value from the Biden administration's perspective is demonstrative. It's to show the world that the United States has an alliance that it can run, that it is committed to, that as Sumantra said, is, if you're inside the tent, you are safe, and that it is something that is central to U.S. policy. They are, in a certain way, seeking to build a bit of a simulacrum to NATO in Asia. It's not exact, of course. In fact, they're not really trying to build a multilateral alliance per se in Asia, but they're very much looking to the sort of values that underlie NATO and the concepts that underlie NATO as they think about the centerpiece of their Asia strategy, which is really very much centered around allies and alliances. There is a deep belief, I think, in the United States that U.S. alliance behavior, things like credibility and leadership, transfers across theaters, which is to say how the United States behaves in NATO particularly, but in other theaters as well, will have a demonstrative effect on how people see U.S. leadership in Asia and in other theaters. And that implies that they have to have a deep commitment to NATO, a deep commitment to European security, and to continuing their role, the U.S. role in the war in Ukraine, not just for its own sake. They do think those things are important for their own sake, but because of what it tells the American people, as well as allies and adversaries abroad, about the broader approach that the Biden administration has and that the United States has to its foreign policy. So obviously there's a contradiction in all of this, and I think it came out a bit in Sumantra's presentation, that at the same time that they feel like that NATO's that the U.S. approach to NATO requires them to have the U.S. approach to alliances requires them to have a deep commitment to NATO and European security, they also need to pivot to Asia. And as was mentioned, I think everybody agrees there is a strong bipartisan consensus that China is the big geopolitical problem of the coming decades, and that the U.S. needs to reconfigure its resources between the theaters in order to have a greater presence and capacity to deal with China in Asia. The Biden administration seeks to do that, quote, responsibly, but they're struggling to, because they can't fail to lead in Europe. And so no one really believes that the United States will actually reduce its commitments to Europe. All of the Biden administration's calls for more European contributions and more European responsibility have had some impact, but they are limited in their success by the deep belief that the administration is conveying itself, that in fact the U.S. commitment to European security, the U.S. commitment to NATO, the U.S. commitment to the concept of alliances means that there is a limit to how much they will leave, and basically means that the U.S. will continue to serve as the backstop for European security. And so why would Europeans contribute that much more? I mean, we've seen them in the context of the war in Ukraine and the context of the Russian reinvasion in 2022, upping their contributions a fair amount. But what's not happening is that Europeans are taking on any sense of leadership. They haven't abandoned the idea that ultimately it will be the US that will be the backstop. And I would argue, although it's a counterfactual and hard to know, that limits their contributions and limits their responsibility. I would predict that a second Biden term would not see a resolution of this contradiction. There will continue, the strong commitment to NATO will persist with their own admitted need to make a pivot. their idea to try to get out of the contradiction will be to seek a resolution of the Ukraine war, and through that, an ability to reduce their commitments to Europe. But how they're going to do that without either a massive military victory, which is problematic given their unwillingness to fight Russia directly, or without coercing their allies, especially Ukraine, but also some of the Eastern European countries, to accept a compromise peace, I think, has not been resolved even within the administration. These contradictions can probably persist for another 4 years, unless there's a big crisis in East Asia. But as Sumantra was saying, they will become less and less bearable as the strategic deficits in Asia become more and more apparent. And if there is a crisis in East Asia, they will become immediately unbearable. And that does create the need for a greater capacity to move in the direction of greater European contributions in a slow, responsible way, even in the next 4 years. Otherwise, I do fear, I guess, as Sumantra does, that there will be a quite sudden shift, probably not in the next Biden administration, but perhaps even in a future Democratic administration, because the strategic deficits in Asia will become simply unbearable. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Jeremy. Sorry for me not being able to write so that you can read it in a mirror, but I think you got it. So Camille, when I raise this, it's 1 minute left. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And now over to you, Camille. And I already want to raise 2 issues that came up in the chat, which you can maybe wave into your introductory remarks already, because there seems to be a strong interest in your take on the French election, kind of the first round yesterday, and people are questioning whether kind of this whole concept of EU strategic autonomy, I don't know, can survive the French election, and whether, when also thinking about a European NATO, how this election basically feeds into this or doesn't. So maybe you can wave that into your introductory remarks. And keep it at 5 minutes, nevertheless.
So you give me another 5, right? No, great to be on this. Let me maybe I'll wrap up with the outcome of the French election, which is still a bit up in the air because we're in between the 2 rounds, so it's a bit difficult to predict. Let me start by saying where the Europeans are in this debate. Of course, they look at it from afar, but they look at it in a way concerned, because what they see is, from their perspective, a degraded security environment with a major war raging in Europe, which has obviously, thanks to NATO, no direct impact on their security, but creates a degree of anxiety that is unprecedented for probably decades. Second, they also see the South and South, their own South and Southeast, that's not being the most quiet place on Earth, which makes them assess that their security environment is not going in the right direction. And finally, there is this issue of a growing doubt about the level of US commitment, which is partially fueled by some comments on the campaign trail by Donald Trump, which immediately trigger concerns over Europe, rightfully or wrongly, but it's there. The good news is that some of this has already been processed. So, compared to where the NATO, the European allies were in 2014, they are spending more, and significantly more. If you look at the latest figures, they are spending $150 billion more than they were in 2014, which was agree a sort of low point, but that's quite a lot of money on a year, on a yearly budget. It's almost a third increase. That's 457 billion spent since 2014 on top of what they would have spent if they had stayed on the same trend. So all of this is significant, even by U.S. standard. You know, it's not only significant by European standard, but it is a significant amount of money. They also are taking, I would say, their fair share, not necessarily during the first year, but that trend has been improving when it comes to assistance to Ukraine, and they are indeed putting more and more their words where their action where their words are, which is to say, okay, if Ukraine is existential, then, you know, spending a few 0 point something of your GDP on Ukraine, on assistance to Ukraine makes sense, and they including in the military realm. So, and they take a large share of the effort on NATO's eastern flank. Which means, and this is where I think we enter an interesting conversation, that from their perspective, NATO is more central to their security than it was probably, you know, half a decade ago. And the new enlargement with Sweden and Finland joining, because they sort of value NATO and see it as a security guarantee. Very broad support for NATO across the allies, the European allies, with very, very few dissenting voice or quasi none. Also support for NATO's adaptation and a degree of a commitment to this. So from this perspective, the general perception is NATO is more necessary than ever. Even the French, and I'll come back to the outcome of the election, which used to have this sort of strategic autonomy narrative, are now more openly talking about a European pillar in NATO. Some might argue it's the same thing. It's not, and that's, I think it is in a sort of interesting evolution there. So from that perspective, and I will maybe rather use the sort of the Dormant NATO as a buzzword rather than the substance of Sumantra's article, which a piece which is, I think there are lots of very interesting things in there, but creates a bit of anxiety amongst Europeans, and as they rather see a vibrant NATO in many ways, because they think it's really important to their security. But I'll come back to what it could look like. So in short, we have a situation where the US electoral debate creates anxiety with the Trump statement on the campaign trail. And what I would argue is the most problematic element in this is the sort of unpredictability, the notion that they don't really know where he's heading. You know, will it be a Trump one on steroid? So difficult conversations, but on the whole, no dramatic changes, or will there be a move, whether on Ukraine or the relationship to NATO, that will destabilize the architecture as it is there? And there, vis-a-vis Biden, there is a sort of strange mix. You know, it's a super comfort zone for many Europeans, starting with the Germans, but many others feel very comfortable with the Biden administration, but also a sort of understanding that it's the last genuine transatlanticist in a way, and that the sort of shift might be coming no matter what. And that's where I would see the rise of forms of hedging strategies, of, you know, that may be labeled Trump-proofing, but in fact are broader than that, and that's where it gets interesting. So it might be about you know, Ukraine. It might be to try and have a sustained defense effort, and also starting looking at reducing dependencies on the US on critical enablers and other critical assets. So my bottom line there is to say that in a way the Europeans are shifting slowly, reluctantly in many instances, because they fear the self-fulfilling prophecy, to recognize that they need to do more for their security, that free riding will not fly, not only in Washington, but in general, and that they have to recognize that, as Sumantra described, the US is going to be more focused on the Indo-Pacific, that also that the US debate is polarized and doesn't necessarily play into Europe's favor always, and that there might be even more disruptive policies coming. So in closing, and I'll add a sentence to your question about the French, there is what I see emerging in a way is a NATO that is vibrant, but that is more European in a way. Because the command structure we need. It can't be replaced easily. Some of the key assets are there. Some of the points that Sumantra was raising of the US playing a last resort role in certain domains is there. I would argue, and then we might disagree, that it also comes with a bigger role for the EU in defense, because the EU is putting money on the table to build up those capabilities, and has played a more strategic role when it comes to Ukraine than it previously did. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. All of this to preserve the transatlantic. And the paradox, and I got the white flag, is two things. All of this might lead to the development of a sort of NATO 3.0, which is something that is a bit that we, for 75 years we've not been used to, and that's going to be interesting. And second, that it might be the sort of bizarre, paradoxical way to achieve an enduring transatlantic link. Coming to the French election in two sentences, the national rally is, one of the core elements is being anti-NATO. But they're also anti-EU. So they are not going to be, shifting to a strategic autonomy fully EU speed, and they're anti-American. So all of this makes it quite complicated to imagine the sort of foreign policy that would come out of this. And what is sure, it's going to make Macron's life more difficult should there be a national rally majority in parliament to push his strategic agenda, including the strategic autonomy agenda, because the parliament will be more difficult when it comes to spending, when it comes to cooperation, when it comes to the EU, and when it comes to NATO.
Thank you, Camille. And now I would like to go into the Q&A session. And I'd like to start with actually two questions to Sumantra. One is from the chat, but one that I had in mind for a long time as well. And it's about nuclear policy. Sumantra, you write in your policy brief that that is not a divorce. Dormant NATO is basically the idea to give the conventional deterrence of Europe into Europe's hands, but to keep the nuclear umbrella in place. And the question I have, and it's loosely connected to the question in the chat, is there was always this thinking that in order for the nuclear dimension to be credible, American soldiers need to die, basically. So you need to have American soldiers on the ground in Europe, and you need to basically link conventional and nuclear deterrence, because who on earth would believe that America is ready to wage a nuclear war over Europe's security if Europe is kind of if they are not even ready to send American soldiers that could die in a fight. So isn't that a contradiction, or isn't that a problem for your argument that basically the nuclear credibility could be severely weakened if detached from the conventional angle? And the other question I got via a text message is actually by my dear colleague Claudia Mayor, and she wants to learn more about your perception of Russia. Because you say basically, yes, Russia is a challenge and it's a powerful country, but it's actually a broken state and it's not that much of a security threat, or it's not a power maximizer. It's not going to seek to expand and to go into NATO territory. So why is that? Where does this come from? And are you also following the domestic debates in Russia, kind of the narratives, the language? Yeah, I start with those two.
Right. So I'll tackle it in order. The first question was about nuclear, perception and capability and nuclear deterrence. One, America. One of the aims of the American strategic community since late 1980s and early 1990s has been the same: to stop nuclear proliferation in Europe, throughout the world, but especially in Europe. There is, for example, if you go back and read the debates that was happening in 1995 about Russian nuclear weapons and Ukraine, we tend to see that the guarantee that we gave Ukraine was that Britain and US would be responsible for Ukraine's security, but fundamentally it was also predicated on the idea that Ukrainian nuclear weapons are not going to go away and be in the hands of local warlords. People don't really talk about that much anymore, but that was one of the, it was a very important debate that was happening in the early 1990s. I see Jeremy is nodding, so he obviously has, remembers those days. That was a debate. There's this idea that Ukraine had all the nuclear weapons and it gave up. It didn't. One, the codes were in Moscow. Two, the nuclear weapons were taken, by the way. It was an understanding that we should take away and stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons in Europe. That strategy is still there. Fundamentally, if you talk to any, American, expert in DC, the idea that Europe that there would be a result of nuclear proliferation. There was the Spiegel article about Atomwaffen coming in Germany. I mean, it's so frustrating. Like it's not going to happen. Like you think about it this way: put a tabletop simulation. Who's going to be in the command structure? Where are those NATO's weapons going to be placed? Where are the testings going to happen? Is France going to give its nuclear weapons to the European Security Command? Is Britain going to give its nuclear weapons? Who's going to have the ultimate button? None of these things matter. It's not going to happen. At the end of the day, if there needs to be a nuclear deterrent in Europe, a continental-wide nuclear deterrent in Europe, it has to be an American. And Americans understand that. Second, to your question, American troops must die. Well, yes and no. One, to keep the nuclear weapons in Europe, the fundamental strategic architecture that would be in dormant NATO would still be Ramstein, would still be encircling in Turkey. None of those things are changing. If American nuclear weapons needs to be and provide deterrence in Europe, even if they're in unmated situations, there would still be logistical problems. And for those logistical problems to be solved, there needs to be bases in Germany and Turkey. Dormant NATO doesn't say that all air bases are coming out of Europe. That is not the point. The point is we don't need an air base, for example, in Portugal. We don't need an air base in Italy to ferry, I don't know, disaster relief or something of that sort. It could be cut down. It could be a minimal, credible deterrence. MCD, which is the I think it's India or China, which has the minimal credible deterrence. I think any nuclear expert would probably be able to mention that. But there is a strategic doctrine where you can have nuclear deterrence, but just cut it down to the basic points. Third, think of a scenario where the eastern parts of Europe's strategic security is threatened directly. What could be a situation? One, there could be Russian tanks rolling in the Baltics. Theoretically possible. I don't see it happening, but yes. If that happens, the moment Russian tanks cross over the border of a NATO country, they are at war with NATO. Article 5 comes into question. Now, whether that Article 5 means that the vanguard of the NATO troops would be American or German or French is a different question. Article 5 essentially puts all the people together in a table to decide on how to reply to the threat. That's what happened after 9/11. It doesn't say how much troops who's going to provide. It brings all together to say that we are under attack and we are going to respond. Fine. The moment Russian tanks cross the NATO border, they are at war with NATO. Again, statistically possible, very unlikely. What could happen is the Russians foment some kind of problem in the Baltics. The Russians foment some kind of local riots and, arsoning and, rebellious movements. That is a police problem. That is a policing matter. If there are Russian-speaking people rioting in Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, to bring down order in those situations is a European policing problem. That is a whole different question. That is not a NATO question. That is not being under attack from Russia. That is a rebellion in the European Union's core territory that could be balanced or solved by a European response. But fundamentally, it's a law and order problem. It is not a military problem. So those are the two questions. I think if you ask my opinion about NATO deterrence can hold without Americans being the primary security provider. at the end of the day, America is not coming out of NATO. It is a treaty guarantee. American troops are going to be in NATO in a diminished posture. American nuclear forces are going to be in NATO. American Navy is going to be NATO. It would be in the Denmark Strait. It would be in the Arctic. It would be in the Mediterranean. I don't foresee a situation where NATO countries think that because we have 10,000 less Americans in Germany, doesn't mean that America isn't there. So that's question number one. Hopefully that's addressed, if not answered properly. Question number two is about Russian threat perceptions. Realism dictates that you ignore what people say, but you see their actual actions. Now, process tracing, for those of you who are foreign policy or political scientists, process tracing is difficult with Kremlin. It's not a free country. It's an authoritarian country. You don't get to see the minutes of the meeting. You don't get to see their, what's happening inside the Kremlin when they discuss. What you can see is how they're moving, what their true posture is, what the debates are in the military journals. That is something that you can read. And from those, you tally with their actions, and then you decide, okay, so this is how you understand Russia. I think Russia is a threat. I don't think Russia is capable. Those are very two different questions. Is Russia a threat to European security? Absolutely. Is Russia capable of hegemony? No. Threat is intention plus capability. I always say this to everyone who asks me. I can intend to be James Bond, but I'm short and fat. It's a different thing. It doesn't matter what you intend to do. It matters what you're capable of doing, right? From the Russian debates, if you see the Russian military journals and if you read them, their core threat perception was always, they don't differentiate between Germany and the West and European Union and NATO. To them, it's all the same, right? They see this inexorable force moving towards their border. But that doesn't mean there is also a section among the realist crowd in the US who thinks that NATO expansion means Russia is reacting. That is the core problem. I don't think so. I've written in my book, if that would have been the case, Russia would have invaded Montenegro. It didn't. Fundamentally, Ukraine and Georgia are different. Ukraine, Georgia, Syria, if you study the Russian interventions in places, you would realize that Russia intervened in those places where it already had strategic security interests. Not in Finland, not in Sweden, not in Montenegro or North Macedonia. In Syria, in Ukraine, in Georgia. Russian pipelines were in Georgia. Russian troops were in Georgia. Russia had a naval base in Syria. Russia had a naval base in Ukraine. Russia's military industrial complex were dependent on materials which were there from eastern Ukraine. SS-18 silos from eastern Ukraine. So where Russia has strategic interests, it is inclined to intervene. Where Russia has no direct strategic interest, it can shout a lot, it can foment issues, it can do, gray zone warfare, it can have memes on Facebook, but it is unlikely to intervene. I think we fall in a trap where we think that the Russian politicians are irrational. They're not. They're actually very rational. During the Cold War, USSR had relative power, conventional power more than NATO. They were more secure in their understanding. Russia isn't conventionally more superior than the European Union or NATO. They understand that very much. I think it is wrong, in my opinion, to understand that the Russians are irrational to the point where they would do something which is strategically destructive to their regime. Now, that is whether I can take it to the bank. I don't know. Tomorrow I might be wrong and I might turn out to be Francis Fukuyama. But so far, the evidence suggests that we shouldn't consider the Russians to be irrational.
Thank you for the clarification. There is another question in the chat, and I give that to my colleagues. But Sumantra, if you want to comment on this later, you're very welcome. And this is I think, $100 million question. How do you think the EU could Trump-proof NATO? What can be discussed and implemented to prepare to a Trump election, to ensure unity and to have leverage? So what is your plan for Europe, Jeremy and Camille? And Camille, first we start with Jeremy, and then I have another sub-question for you, Camille, as well.
Camille always gets the good questions. Okay. Look, I guess I have to say I really don't like this idea of Trump-proofing NATO, fundamentally because you cannot proof NATO against any president of the United States. The president of the United States can eliminate the vitality and utility of NATO in a few sentences, because after all, NATO is not fundamentally the troops on the ground in Europe. NATO is fundamentally the sense that allies and adversaries have that the US is committed to European security, and that commitment exists and for a given 4 years in the person of the President of the United States. So there is no Trump-proofing NATO. Having said that, I think the sort of broader point is that, what should Europeans be doing to help their own security in the context of a Trump administration, in the context of all of the geopolitical trends that we've been talking about? And those things are blatantly obvious. I think all three of us have hit on them, and they're not really a big mystery. I mean, they should be, in the first instance, doing more to provide for their own defense, but in the second instance, and slightly less obviously, they should be taking more responsibility for their own defense, which is not the same thing as having more contributions. And here, maybe I differ a little bit with Camille, which is the idea that, in fact, even though there has been a big increase in European military spending since 2014, it's actually less than the American increase since 2014. And Europeans have become more dependent on the United States in the last 10 years than they. And that's not just about military spending, it's about a whole bunch of things. But fundamentally, to me, it is about their incapacity or unwillingness to take responsibility for their security more than it is about their spending, although it is also about their spending. So I think that those are things that they could do that would make, wouldn't exactly Trump-proof NATO, but would make European security safer given the geopolitical trends that are happening, and given the possibility that Trump administration, which will be quite hostile to NATO, is in the White House.
Thank you very much. Camille, I want to hear your advice to Europe, but also there is a question in the chat. So in order to Trump-proof Europe and to have more burden sharing and a more autonomous Europe, there was one question on European nuclear deterrence. And that brings me to the question whether you think, like coming back to the first question to Sumantra, that something needs to change when it comes to European nuclear deterrence policy. And I don't know exactly how the question is meant. How could a European nuclear deterrence policy fit in with a less engaged US? But I think the question is hinting at the fact, do we need a more kind of European, or is there any European alternative to a US security guarantee? I hope that was the question.
Okay. Now, first of all, let me start by agreeing with Jeremy on the fact that the issue is not to Trump-proof NATO. Eventually, Trump-proofing Europe, I cannot go against that, having written this piece in Foreign Affairs, but the idea from my perspective is really to say, okay, the point is NATO, if the US president decides to pull the plug on NATO, it suffices a statement to make the alliance very, very hollow, even though Congress can decide that they will stay, or might even still be US troops in Europe. I think it, in the event of even a modest event, and this is where maybe I would partially disagree with Sumantra on the fact that even some sort of Russian testing of the robustness of NATO might be a big crisis, even though I would agree that, of course, Russia is not the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact combined. But there might be this temptation to test the robustness of this. And I always keep in mind a comment by Baltic colleagues on the weaknesses of Russia, which is to say, okay, we all point at the failure of Russia in Ukraine and the fact that it failed to capture a large portion of Ukraine. They nevertheless captured more or less the equivalent of the 3 Baltic states in 3 days. So this is a problem that we have to collectively fix if we are serious about this as an alliance. Second, when on the plan to do this, I think I would say a few things. We need to have a plan for Ukraine to say, okay, what is that the Europeans want to do about Ukraine if they want to avoid to be simply watching the consequences of a US decision on this. So they have to have their own plan and be able to sustain it. Second, of course, they need to spend more and acquire the capabilities and rebuilding mass. And I totally agree with the idea that the rebuilding of mass needs to come from European forces, and that many European forces have become very hollow since the end of the Cold War, and that takes time and money, and this is a decade-long endeavor. And I would add to that the acquisition of some of the critical enablers where the dependencies on the US are the most visible. So that's a sort of capability dimension. I do agree with the partially and partially disagree with Jeremy on the fact that I do agree that political will and institutions matter. So being more serious about that and thinking through what it does mean in practice in an EU context, in a NATO context, is really, really important. But it is also a matter of money and capabilities there. To start with there. On the European deterrence, I guess my approach to this is somewhat nuanced. First of all, I do believe that we have a debate coming, and simply because Russia is over-relying on nuclear weapons, and that makes it's probably the domain where it is most capable of inflicting pain and threats on the Europeans. Second, because there are the US nuclear enterprise is resource constrained and has to deal with the peer competition with emerging peer competition with China and so on. So it is there. And thirdly, because of all the debates we were just having about the level of US commitment, Churchill used to say, I only need one US soldier in Europe, preferably dead. You know, amongst there are multiple fake Churchill quote. I think it's a good one. But still, the point there is that there is an open question there. And I think the question goes to all the players. So not only to Paris and London. There is a question to the US. How do you see the future of your nuclear role in Europe? And Sumantra offers a rather reassuring answer to that of saying the commitment will remain. But others might take a different path. So that's important to keep in mind. Second, but I don't hear many saying we're going to grow the US investment in extended deterrence in Europe. Second, there is a question to Paris and London. We've been saying since 1974 that the French and British nuclear forces have an independent role of their own. We've never fully operationalized that. So what does that mean in practice? Does it mean that UK and France need to change their posture, change their doctrine, engage and talk with the others? And finally, there is a question to all the non-nuclear allies who seem to be sitting and watching this with a pot of popcorn, is to say, what role do you want to play in this? Are you ready to host? Are you willing to host French forces on your side? Are you ready to play a bigger role in the DCA mission? Are you ready to? Do you want to fly those missions? You're not doing it already. I mean, those are questions. Do you want to build a missile defense shield? Do you want to build conventional long-range strike capabilities? I mean, all these questions are on the table for the Europeans, and some are very vocal, the Poles. Others are pretty much dodging the question because it's an unpleasant question to answer. So this is where we are, and I'll stop there. But I do think so. In one word, I think the Europeans have a bigger role to play in deterrence in general, including nuclear deterrence. And that might but the objective should be to strengthen the extended deterrent by the US by saying, okay, we play our share in this as well.
Thank you, Camille. We are nearly out of time, but I want to give our guest, Sumantra Maitra, the last word to Europeans. And so maybe you have some last advice to, if you were European, you would have read your own paper. What would you basically want your fellow Europeans to do? What would be your advice? So how can we confront a scenario as you describe it?
Well, my first advice would be, don't think that I'm Richelieu. I'm not an expert of, at the end of the day, it's Europe's problem. Europe needs to figure it out and so on. But anyway, so the thing that I would want to say is the debate that I see in Europe is very broad. It's very, how do I put it, detached. It's very broad-based. Like, everyone is talking about what is going to happen if NATO changes, or the European strategic autonomy, or what would be the European Union's financial decisions to be had, what kind of trade dictates needs to, just forget about those things. Those are massive questions that there are very simple things that you guys can start doing, Europe can start doing tomorrow, and that doesn't need any of the debates. Forget about European Union's strategic architecture. Think of how, I don't buy that 52% thing. I know there's a huge thing in America. Everyone says like, oh, every single country in Europe needs to pay 2%. I think that's a stupid idea. You can just hype up 2% by, actually, I do believe with the German strategic position, like, it's not about what percentage of defense you're spending, it's how you're spending it. So you can have pension funds of the former military soldiers and add it to the 2% of defense. That doesn't really help much. The second thing that I would like to point out is, no offense to anyone else listening, but fundamentally, the American special relationship is not with the UK, not with France, it's with Germany. Germany needs to take its part. Even when the Trump administration talks about Germany's not doing its part, it comes from a position where Germany needs to do its part, because it is the biggest power in the center of Europe. Germany was the absolute hinge point of American Cold War strategy, and that is what it needs to be. So regardless of whether it's President Biden, whether Democrats or the Republicans, Germany would remain the most powerful actor in the center of Europe. How they're going to use that is up to Germany. So that's point number 2. But to go back to the original question, there are very simple things that you guys can do. Figure out coordinations when it comes to logistics. When striker brigades are going from Germany to Lithuania, it shouldn't be American striker brigades. It should be German, or French armored cars. That's a very simple thing to do. Figure out coordination when it comes to interoperability of weapons. For example, the shell production thing is a very simple, thing. You don't have to produce different kind of shells. You can produce one single type of shells. Europe has probably like 12 different type of tanks. Simple thing to do. Figure out a way where you guys can have like one single system of tanks. Interoperability is a very simple thing to do. You don't need American, missile defense in Italy. It could be Italian missile defense. It's very simple. So coordination, logistics, junior commands, mini ententes between the French and Greek, for example, have a great system where they have interoperable navy in the Mediterranean guarding some of the places. Interestingly enough, not against Russia but against Turkey, but it is there. So there are ways Europe can do its part without having to debate with the very broad ideas, which is not going to come in play anyway. Like, stop debating about nuclear weapons. Start thinking about what kind of trucks are you going to use when you're moving troops from one part of Europe to other. Simple things to do. It doesn't take much. It's a very, very simple thing that tomorrow Europe can change. Okay,
that is that's very hands-on. I recently attended a meeting where kind of somebody else explained me that Europe cannot defend itself without America. Now you say, Sumantra, that it doesn't have to. It just needs to contribute more and kind of pay a broader share of the burden, of not only pay it, but shoulder it, and to take over more responsibility in order to have better burden sharing. So I think many people here now understand your concept better and what you had in mind. And thank you very much for discussing with us. Thanks very much to my colleagues. And yeah, we will watch the US election campaign very carefully, and need to live with whatever outcome. And in that sense, I come back to what I think Camille has said, that we need to do it regardless of who wins. So it's up to us. I think that's was the healthy kind of lecture that we heard today. So have a wonderful rest of the day or evening, depending on where you are. And yeah, stay well and join us again for future webinars.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.